Raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
All right, you're going to go up this ramp. Have a seat to my left.
Would you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Sure. My name is Kyle Mueller. I'm a forensic scientist section supervisor with the City of Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab.
How long have you worked for the City of Phoenix Crime Lab?
For about 24 years now.
And can you tell us the different duties you have done over those 24 years?
Sure. I started out in the controlled substances section where I analyzed illicit drugs for the presence or absence of an illicit drug. I then transferred to the trace evidence section in 2007 and was a forensic scientist 2, and then a forensic scientist 3, and then a 4, and then now I'm the supervisor. In the trace evidence section, I analyze gunshot residue kits, footwear and tire track impression evidence, fibers, tape, and miscellaneous unknowns.
Can you tell us the education and training you've had in the area of trace evidence specific to GSR, gunshot residue?
Sure. Well, to start, I have a bachelor's of science in biochemistry. That's from the University of Arizona. I also have a master's of science in forensic science from the University of Florida. I've been trained by senior members of the crime lab, but I've also received several training opportunities for trace evidence, whether it's internal or external where possible. Specifically towards gunshot residue, there's a lot of history in the scientific literature for reading about what GSR is and how it's created. It's also a matter of going through the specific training program with the Phoenix PD Crime Lab. So I went through that, and I'm also proficiency tested on a yearly basis.
Can you tell us how long was that training at the City of Phoenix to work in the trace area?
Well, the training is ongoing, but so each subdiscipline in trace evidence, you need to go through the training program and then become competent in that subdiscipline. And for specifically, for gunshot residue, it was about 6 to 8 months.
And then you said you have ongoing proficiency training. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Sure. Every year I receive a proficiency test to verify that I'm valid or competent in analyzing gunshot residue.
Well, let's start with then, what is gunshot residue?
Sure. Gunshot residue, or GSR for short, are small metallic particles that are formed from the discharge of a firearm. So when someone shoots a gun, these small particles are made up of the elements of lead, antimony, and barium that are from the primer paste inside the bottom of a cartridge casing. That primer paste essentially is disintegrated, and we're left with these GSR particles that escape from any part of the firearm that's not completely closed in the manufacturing process. There are effectively 3 classifications that we test for gunshot residue. There's characteristic particles that have all 3 elements of lead, antimony, and barium. There's also consistent particles that have 2 of the 3 of those, so lead and barium, or lead and antimony, or antimony and barium. There's also commonly associated particles, and those are just lead particles. So that plume of smoke that you see when you shoot a gun, a lot of that plume, if you will, are these small metallic particles.
When that plume lands on things, is it visible? Can I look over here and say, hey, there's a GSR particle?
No, these are very small. They're anywhere from 5, 10, maybe 5 or 15 microns in width. To give you an example, if you were to take a cross-section of a human hair, that's around 60 to 90 microns. So these are very small particles. You can't see them with the naked eye. We have a very high-powered microscope in the in the trace evidence section called an SEM, and that's what we use for our analysis.
So does it matter if someone fires a handgun or a rifle? Is it going to be the same particles you're looking for?
Those same particles are generated regardless of the caliber of firearm used or the ammunition used. We still look for those 3 elements within that same type of particle.
When someone discharges a gun, what factors might impact whether or not that GSR residue particles are left on a person or objects around the gun?
Well, you can imagine when someone shoots a gun, it's kind of like that plume of smoke that's generated. It's kind of like smoking a cigarette. That plume of smoke is going to travel one way or the other based on if you're outside, if you're inside, if you're and it's a windy day or if it's raining. So if you're in an enclosed space, depending on and where the wind velocity is, it's going to depend on where that travels.
So if a person fires a gun from inside a vehicle while it's parked, would you in general expect to find GSR particles inside that vehicle?
Yes, it's certainly possible.
Okay. Can GSR particles over time get lost or removed from whatever object they have attached to after the gun is discharged?
So these particles, like I said before, they're like a fine metallic dust. They don't have a half-life. They don't decay over time. They don't evaporate. They're simply just washed away. So if GSR particles are found on an object, they will stay there indefinitely until they're washed away.
Okay. Have you seen cases where GSR was found inside a vehicle weeks or months after someone has fired a gun inside that car?
It's possible, yes.
In a case where it's alleged that a person was inside a rear portion of a Jeep and fired a rifle out the back window, would it be within the normal scope of possibilities to locate GSR on the windows of that vehicle a month after the shooting?
It's possible, yes.
Would it be impacted if, say, someone went in the Jeep and sprayed some Windex and cleaned off all the windows? Would that then remove it?
Yes, it would possibly remove any GSR.
So when we're talking about collection of an item that's not immediately after the discharge, does the fact of someone cleaning or not cleaning the area around the discharge impact the potential to collect those particles?
Yes, it would potentially remove those particles.
Can you tell us, in general, what you are provided with and then how you look for GSR particles with the kit you are given?
Sure. Depending on the case, a general GSR kit has vials inside of that kit. They're labeled usually about where they are collected from. There's essentially a plastic vial, and when you open up, when you open up the cap to that plastic vial, on the inside of that cap is a small aluminum stub that has effectively sticky tape on it. And that tape is used to sample an area. The portion being, or the idea behind that is that if you have GSR on an area, whether it's someone's hands or an inanimate object, you would then stub that sample, and then any GSR on that sample will then be transferred to that stub. Now, those GSR stubs are then introduced as evidence into the laboratory, and that's where I come in and I test that evidence. So the GSR vials and those stubs are essentially, they come in a GSR kit that's labeled depending on the evidence, and then start my note-taking process regarding what the GSR labels say, where they're taken from, and then I essentially take those stubs out of those vials and place them in an instrument called an SEM EDS. And that essentially stands for Scanning Electron Microscopy with Energy Dispersive X-ray Spectroscopy. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm introducing those stubs into that SEM because it's a very high-powered microscope to view these very small particles. I then analyze the kit with a program that we have for looking for GSR particles. The program then generates a report of what it found, and then I go back typically the next day and try to determine if these were actual GSR particles that were detected by the instrument or whether they were not. And then I compile my report with my results.
You told us earlier that there are 3 different elements you are looking for. What is the significance of locating 1, 2 of them together, or all 3 of those elements together in one particle? So
one particle that has all 3 elements is called characteristic, meaning that that is unlikely to have come from any other source in the environment other than from the discharge of a firearm. Two of those, a consistent particle is two of those elements, so lead and antimony, or lead and barium, or antimony and barium. And those are consistent particles, meaning that while they're also associated with the discharge of a firearm, they're also found in the environment. Lead is a commonly associated with particle, and while it's found in the environment, it's also found in, again, GSR, this plume of smoke that we see when someone discharges a weapon.
So you told us you work for the Phoenix Police Department. Do you still, or does your agency assist other agencies with processing GSR kits?
Yes, we do.
On January of 2020, were you provided with 2 GSR collection kits from the Gilbert Police Department?
Yes, I was.
And were those marked with the Gilbert property identification numbers of 645-886 and 645-888?
Yes,
Were you asked to analyze these?
I was.
When you receive those, do you note whether or not they are integrity seals have been kept there and that they are still properly sealed when they arrive to you?
Yes, I do.
And were they still properly sealed with all integrity seals on them?
Yes, they were.
Now, the kits or the vials, do those come inside their own container and then each vial itself is also individually sealed? With the tag, I guess?
So the vials themselves that have the GSR stubs in them aren't individually sealed. They're usually anyway 3 to 4 of a pack, if you will, of vials. And then inside of that, or excuse me, those vials are then inside another envelope, which is inside the GSR kit.
Do the vials, though, have their own, I guess you indicated label, tape, whatever we want to say, going around them indicating what each one is from?
Yes.
Okay. So in this case, when you received those 2 kits, each of the vials had their own tape with the labeling and then were packaged in sealed packaging.
Yes, that's correct.
And when you were provided with these 2 items, these 2 kits, did you, can you tell us what your initial process was?
Sure. I received notification from the Gilbert Police Department of where exactly these GSR vials were collected, so I could get a better idea of what to test first. So I got that information, and then I started my analysis on one of the GSR kits from 3 of the vials were from the inside of the Jeep, specifically the windows.
Why did you want to test the windows of the Jeep versus the tabs that may have been from, say, the back of the seats of the Jeep?
Well, testing the windows first I thought was pertinent because they're more likely to not come into contact with an item that would previously had GSR on it. If GSR is on the inside of a window, unless it's been cleaned, it would probably be there still.
Okay. The GSR kit that you decided to test, did that contain stubs from the passenger side interior back window, the passenger side interior window, and the driver's side interior window?
Yes.
I assume you used the same process with the SEM microscope that you described?
Yes, that's correct.
And then you independently confirm whether or not what the microscope located is in fact the items it indicates?
Correct.
For this one, starting with the passenger side interior back window, did you find any particles in that collection kit commonly associated with GSR?
Yes.
And so again, so we understand for commonly associated, what does that mean?
That means those are lead particles.
Okay, so just the single individual lead particles, and you found those on that stub?
Correct.
So for that same passenger side interior back window, did you find any particles consistent with GSR?
Yes, I did.
And again, just so we understand, what does consistent with GSR mean?
That means 2 of the 3 elements from a characteristic particle are present.
And do you in fact even note how many of those particles you find?
Yes, I do.
When you are looking for those, do you count every single one on the entire stub? Or do you, at some point, say that's enough to show they're there?
After 10, essentially, I stop. So if it's anything less than 10, I count and put that in my notes.
All right. When you were looking at this passenger side interior back window, did you find any particles that were characteristic of GSR?
Yes, I did.
And again, what does characteristic mean?
That means it has one particle that has the elements of lead, antimony, and barium. That is kind of a round or amorphous morphology that is characteristic of being from the discharge of a firearm.
Okay. So when you located the commonly associated, consistent with, and characteristic particles, what was your conclusion as to the kit that was used to collect from the passenger side interior back window?
Again, that area of the Jeep is consistent with being in the vicinity of a discharged firearm or even coming into contact with something that had GSR on it.
Okay. Was one of the other vials that we discussed from the passenger interior window?
Yes.
Did you find any particles commonly associated with GSR on that stub?
Yes, I did.
How about consistent with or characteristic of?
No, I did not.
So what was your conclusion as to that vial where you just had particles commonly associated with GSR?
So to back up, when I put together my report, I took the results from all 3 samples that I tested and made my conclusion on that. If I'm looking at individual vials, so the vial that we just spoke about that had just the commonly associated with, that means that, again, a discharged weapon could have occurred within the vicinity of that sample being taken, but it could also come from an environmental source as well. But that's just for that one sample.
In a vehicle where a gun is discharged and the samples aren't collected till about a month later, why is it important to look at multiple locations?
Well, so when a gun is discharged and you think of that plume of smoke, those GSR particles are going to travel anywhere potentially in the inside of that vehicle. So any of those areas could potentially have GSR on them. So when I performed my analysis on those samples, really finding where they are specifically in the Jeep isn't really an indication that something happened. It was just finding any in the Jeep. So it doesn't really matter where they originated or where I found them. It's just that they were present.
Okay, so you're really just looking to see, are those characteristic particles present within this Jeep that would indicate that a gun may have been discharged within that vehicle?
That is correct.
So we talked about 2 of the 3 vials. Was the 3rd vial the driver's side interior window?
Yes.
Did you find particles commonly associated with GSR on that vial from the driver's side interior window?
Yes, I did.
Did you find particles consistent with GSR on that driver's side interior window?
Yes.
And did you find particles characteristic of GSR on that driver's side passenger or driver's side interior window?
Yes, I did.
When you then were looking at all 3 of those in different areas within that Jeep, were you then able to reach an overall conclusion as to this vehicle where these kits were taken from?
Yes, I was.
What was your conclusion?
That the inside of the vehicle was, again, in the vicinity of a firearm when it was discharged or came into contact with an item that had GSR on it.
Okay. And then given the locations of the collection sites, that was done to try to look for places where potentially the areas may not have been washed?
Correct.
And when you were talking about something coming into contact with those locations, are you also thinking about the fact that if someone puts a gun in their car, it's not usually on a window?
Correct. I wouldn't test like the back seat of a vehicle knowing that someone used that vehicle to go hunting or go to a shooting range in case they put their firearm in the back of their vehicle.
So if the collection had only been, for instance, of the seats of the vehicles, that may have been less, that may have played into your conclusion some?
My first initial analysis, yes.
In this case, because you were looking at windows in this vehicle, were those stubs specifically chosen by you because they were the windows that were collected?
Yes.
I have no other questions for this witness.
All right, Cross.
Just a few questions. Mr. Mueller, you had said that a gun may have been discharged in this vehicle. Is that your conclusion?
Yes.
Okay. And just so I understand, because I'm trying to wrap my head around that, the 3 particles altogether, right?
Yes.
Antimony, barium, and lead, all 3 make it actually GSR. Is that correct?
So there's 3 classifications. All 3 of those elements in one particle is considered a characteristic particle, which is considered a GSR particle. But there's also the 2 component and the 1 component particles that I detected are also considered GSR.
Right. And so in your report, you say they're also found from a number of relatively common non-firearm sources. Is that also correct?
It's possible, yes.
And what are the non-firearm sources? Could you tell me some of those?
Sure. For lead, lead used to be prominent in gasoline and paint years ago. Lead can still be used in solder or varying manufacturing facilities. The 2 component particles are less common, but they also can be found in maybe some cosmetics or fireworks. But again, those are less common.
Okay. So would you find an actual GSR where all 3 elements were together in fireworks? Like if a firework went off in the vicinity?
No, ma'am.
You would never find GSR after fireworks?
3 component particle, no.
So you would find either consistent or commonly associated?
It's possible depending on the firework.
Okay. What about from brake dust?
Again, that's possible, yes.
What about from fertilizer?
I'm not familiar with fertilizer having those specific elements.
What about hairspray?
I'm not familiar with hairspray being a component or having those components.
Okay. So of the kits that you took, of the stubs that you had that you actually tested, how many all 3 particles did you find together, grouped together?
So 2, one on the driver's side and one on the passenger side on the inside windows.
So just 2?
Correct.
And so if a firearm were to be shot in the back of the Jeep, would you expect to find more than 2 from all the stubs that you analyzed?
It's difficult to determine how many particles are actually there. I'm essentially getting a sample of that area. So the number is not really pertinent to my analysis.
So is it safe to say that whoever was the person who got the stubs would be deciding what you would end up analyzing later? You wouldn't have any control over that, right?
Correct. I didn't collect the stubs.
Okay. So out of the 2 that you found, out of how many stubs did you actually analyze? I'm sorry, I missed that.
So I analyzed 3. In total, there were 8 collected.
Okay. That's all, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Just briefly. For the characteristic particles with all three elements. Did you find one of those in the passenger side interior back window?
Yes.
And did you find two of those characteristic particles in the driver's side interior window?
Yes, I did.
You were asked about some different things like hairspray and brake dust. Are those things that would create the three particle characteristic items that we're talking about that are characteristic of GSR?
No, they would not.
So no matter how much hairspray we use in the car, you're not going to get antimony, barium, and lead stuck together into a particle?
No.
No matter how many fireworks we blow off in the back of this Jeep, we're not going to get the antimony, the barium, and the lead together as a characteristic particle?
No, ma'am.
So is this why it doesn't really matter how many you find? The fact that it's there is what's important?
Correct.
Because when you find the particles that have all three of those, that is what's the most meaningful of all of this.
Yes.
And that's because for the single, just lead, we could come up with some reason why that might be there, right?
Correct.
And for even the consistent with, maybe you can come up with some reasons why it's there.
Correct.
But when we start talking about those characteristic particles, that means it's gunshot residue.
Correct. And the reason why I list out the other two classes, if you will, the consistent and commonly associated with, is because I expect to see all three types in the discharge of a firearm.
So when we are looking for the discharge of a firearm in a, we'll call it vehicle, as we were talking about here, you wouldn't expect to only find the characteristic particles.
No, I would not.
You would expect to find the single particles, the two combination, and all three together.
That's correct.
Exactly what you found here.
Correct.
I have no other questions.
Are there any questions for this witness from any member of the jury? I don't see any, sir. You can step down.
Thank you.
State can call its next witness.
Thank you.